The day Russia invaded one of its neighbors, waged a bloody war, and seized a fifth of that neighbor's territory, fear and shock rippled throughout the region. We're not talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, rather the small country of Georgia. That invasion was more than 15 years ago. Vladimir Putin's playbook hasn't changed much. Today, Georgia, which shares a 556-mile border with Russia, is still trying to remove the grip of the Kremlin. Days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Georgia submitted an application to become part of the European Union, with hopes of gaining a Western insurance policy to protect it. Tonight, you will hear from the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili. The daughter of Georgian refugees raised in Paris, she says that Vladimir Putin has launched a quiet invasion of Georgia in an attempt to extend Russia's reach.
The story will continue in a moment.
The war in Ukraine is now moving into its third year. How is the war there impacting life here?
It is, of course, a reminder of everything that this country has gone through and of the fact that it's always an immediate danger and threat. It's already part of the reality that Russia is testing the ground.
You think the Russians are testing the ground right now in Georgia?
Right now.
How so?
Here, their easy way is the hybrid war.
A hybrid war that has included online and televised disinformation campaigns and anti-Western propaganda pumped into Georgia, a favorite tactic of the Kremlin. Georgians have seen it before. In 2008, 3 weeks before Russia launched its first airstrike in Georgia, Moscow hit the country with a series of cyber attacks. The 5-day bloody battle that followed ended with Russia seizing 20% of Georgia's land. President Zurabishvili says the mostly muted international reaction to that war laid the groundwork for Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's plan to bring former Soviet republics back into the Russian fold. Today, a fifth of Georgia is occupied by the Russian military, and an estimated 8,000 Russian troops are inside the Georgian border. We traveled with Georgian security forces 37 miles outside the capital of Tbilisi into the tiny village of Kurvaleti. Today, it is a rural no man's land.
Oh my.
Across a rickety bridge, we found an abandoned stretch of farmland choked off by barbed wire, warning signs to stay out,
Oh, there she is.
and a defiant 87-year-old Valya Vanishvili.
The Russians have told me this is our land, and I said no. Our land is in Russia. This is our land, not yours. You have no rights here.
How long have you been surrounded by the barbed wire?
For 15 years.
In 2008, her land was seized by Russian troops. The grandmother of 4 still refuses to surrender her home. Cut off from family, she relies on outsiders and a stick to deliver food and the medicine she needs. She whispered to us that the Russians were watching us from over that hill.
Are you afraid of the Russians?
Yes, I'm afraid of them. What if they take me and detain me? Nobody can help me. I'm alone. When it's only a couple of them, I can always answer them and fight back. But when it's a lot of them, there is nothing I can do.
Georgia is bordered on the north by Russia, the east by Azerbaijan, and the south by Armenia and Turkey. The bridge between the Black and Caspian Sea, an important route for natural gas and oil. High up in the mountains of Georgia, we saw another reason the small country of nearly 4 million is crucial to the Kremlin. A long line of trucks, many of them carrying European cargo across the border into Russia. United Nations data shows that since the war began, everything from cars to chemicals have rolled into Russia through Georgia, some in violation of Western sanctions, a lifeline for Putin's regime. There is traffic coming into Georgia, too. Thousands of Russian nationals entering the country in cars and on foot, extending for miles and arriving in waves, first at the beginning of the Ukraine war in 2022, and again last September when fighting-age men fled Russia's mandated military service. But some Georgians worry Putin loyalists could be entering the country too, laying the groundwork for Russia's next move. When Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, he said it was to, among other things, protect the Russians living there. President Zurabishvili fears Putin could launch a similar campaign in Georgia. Since the war, Georgia has become home to 100,000 Russians.
It's very unnerving when in your own country you have people that are talking the language of the enemy and that believe that they're at home.
The Russians believe that they are at home.
They're behaving and believing that they are very much at home. So there is a fine line, and that line has to be kept so that we do not have incidents in the future that would allow Russia to use their favored doctrine of protecting Russian-speaking citizens.
So why doesn't Georgia just say no more Russians through our border?
That is a question for the authorities.
Aren't you the authority?
No, I don't have the executive powers, and unfortunately.
The executive power to control Georgia's borders is squarely in the hands of its prime minister, Irakli Garibashvili. Publicly, he said that he supports the country's bid to move away from neighboring Russia and join the European Union. But his actions and inactions tell a different story. Since the Ukraine invasion, Prime Minister Garibashvili agreed to resume flights between Tbilisi and Moscow for the first time in almost 5 years. He's also failed to adopt strong sanctions against Russia. Critics of the prime minister accuse him of being in the pocket of a Georgian oligarch, Bidzina Ivanishvili, a billionaire who helped get him elected. The 67-year-old oligarch made his fortune in Russia and served a brief stint as Georgia's prime minister. His $50 million home looms over Tbilisi, a reminder of his wealth and power. Last summer, European lawmakers called for sanctions against the oligarch for his, quote, links to the Kremlin, a connection that could undermine Georgia's EU bid.
We're going in with a government that's completely corrupt, a government that's pro-Russian, clearly anti-Western, clearly does not really care about what the majority of the population wants and needs.
Anna Tavadze and Daci Medadze are members of the Shame movement, a group with thousands of young followers working towards Georgia's entry into the European Union.
If Russia wins, it means loss of freedom, loss of everything that we fought for in the past 30 years, basically. It's a fight for values. It's a fight for where you want to stand in this big fight for democracy.
As soon as West in any form, be it the US partnership, be it European Union, is not represented in this country, Russia will fill the void right away.
They say the influx of Russians is already changing the face of Georgia.
What are they doing if we look at it? They're buying apartments, they're buying private property, they're opening up businesses. Their actions changed Georgian economy.
The Russians are buying apartments here in every 33 minutes. They're purchasing a piece of land in every 27 minutes, and they're registering a business in every 26 minutes. So I think we're on the brink of a very dangerous situation here in Georgia.
According to public records, Russians have registered 21,000 businesses in Georgia over the last 18 months and launched 5 new Russian-only schools, none of which are licensed by Georgia's Department of Education. Russians have driven rent up nearly 130%. Prices for everything from food to cars have gone up 7%. Over 100,000 Georgians have left the country because many of them can't afford to live here anymore.
I've heard this described as a quiet invasion.
Quiet invasion, yeah. There's a risk of the economic divergence, there's a risk of military intervention, and there's a risk of Georgia's statehood being destroyed.
Emmanuel Lisnev, George Smorgulenko, and Pavel Bakadov don't look like much of a threat. All Russians in their 20s, they fled their country for fear of being drafted or imprisoned for speaking out against Putin. They now live in Georgia and work at this Russian-owned comedy club in Tbilisi.
I said I'm against the war in Russia. I was beaten, and after that gone to prison 3 times.
So 3 times you went to jail?
Yes, 3 times.
I believe and I know that Russians actually against the war.
You think that most Russians are against the war?
Yeah, just scared, really scared.
Have any of you had any aggression towards you because you're Russian?
Actually, I have a big writing on the wall. It is the biggest thing I see from my window, just big Russians go home.
There is no subtlety in spray paint. Anti-Russian graffiti blankets the city along with support for Ukraine. On crumbling walls, the Georgian flag is joined with those of the European Union, the U.S., and NATO. Over 80% of the Georgian public backs entry into the EU, as does Georgian President Zurabishvili. But her position has become increasingly ceremonial as the country moves towards a parliamentary government. After she went to Europe to try and pave the way for Georgia's EU bid, Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili accused her of violating the Constitution, banned her from traveling to Europe, and tried but failed to impeach her. President Zurabishvili has defiantly continued to fly to Europe to meet with leaders on her own dime.
It doesn't seem like the Prime Minister is interested in joining the EU.
Well, that's a question that the whole population is asking, whether they really want it or whether it's lip service.
This is a critical time. Do you feel like the West, particularly the U.S., has been responsive enough and supportive enough of Georgia in this moment?
I don't think so. And I would take one concrete example. I've been a president now for 5 years. And I've not managed to have any form of meeting at my level, which would be the president or the vice president, even through a phone call. I understand that there are more urgent issues, but I think that some more public recognition is needed.
Recognition of?
Of the fact that the United States is supporting our candidate status within the European Union. I know that that is the language that the US has with our European partners, but that being repeated at the highest level would be meaningful for the Georgian population.
The EU has laid out a list of requirements for Georgia to become a candidate for membership. The conditions include tackling corruption and lessening the economic and political influence of domestic oligarchs. A decision is expected by the end of the year.
What happens to Georgia if the EU denies the bid?
It would be a big victory for Russia.
A victory Valya Vanashvili refuses to give them. 87 years old, she says she is holding her ground for herself and for Georgia.